Most of the time, when people talk about why civilizations collapse, they reach for simple answers: bad leaders, weak armies, economic mismanagement, a sudden crisis that came out of nowhere. But history almost never works that way, because long before an empire falls, it starts feeling different. Trust thins, institutions harden, wealth concentrates, and people sense that something important has slipped, even if they can't yet name it. What's surprising is that one man explained this entire process more than 600 years ago. Not a modern economist, not a political scientist, but a 14th century Muslim scholar watching societies rise and quietly decay. His name was Ibn Khaldun, and while most history textbooks treat him as a footnote, his ideas still echo through every modern financial crisis, every collapsing state, and every society wondering how it lost its balance. Because Ibn Khaldun didn't just record events, he asked why they repeated. To understand why his ideas matter, you have to let go of the way we're usually taught history. We're told that progress moves forward in a straight line, that each generation learns, improves, and builds something stronger than what came before. Ibn Khaldun saw something else entirely. He saw cycles. He saw societies that began lean, united, and disciplined. He saw them grow wealthy, confident, and powerful. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, he saw them rot from the inside. Not because they ran out of resources, not because the numbers stopped adding up, but because the social glue holding them together dissolved. And once that glue was gone, collapse was no longer a question of if, only when. Here's the unsettling part. He wasn't writing theory from a distance. Ibn Khaldun lived inside power. He served courts. He advised rulers. He watched elites justify excess, manipulate institutions, and insulate themselves from consequences, right up until the system that protected them gave way. That perspective gave him something rare: immunity to comforting illusions. Where others saw temporary instability, he saw structural decay. Where rulers blamed enemies, he pointed to incentives. Where historians described events, he mapped mechanisms. And the mechanism he identified explains far more than medieval empires. It explains why wealth often accelerates inequality instead of stability. Why institutions lose legitimacy even while growing more complex. Why money keeps moving faster, while meaning drains out of the system. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, that's not an accident. Because Ibn Khaldun wasn't predicting a single collapse. He was outlining a pattern, one that reappears whenever societies forget what actually holds them together. And that pattern begins in a place most people overlook. Not the battlefield, not the throne, but the market. Picture a city at its peak. Markets packed, shoulder to shoulder, voices overlapping in a dozen accents. The smell of spices, leather, ink, metal. Merchants arguing over price. Laborers unloading goods. Officials counting taxes. Money changing hands. So often it feels endless. On the surface, this is success. And Ibn Khaldun paid close attention to moments like this, because he believed prosperity always tells the truth before decline does. In the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, Tunis, Cairo, Fez, trade didn't just move goods, it organized society. Artisans, scholars, soldiers, traders, bureaucrats, everyone had a role, and every role depended on trust. Trust that contracts would be honored, trust that weights were fair, trust that the coin you received today would still mean something tomorrow. As long as that trust held, the city thrived. But Ibn Khaldun noticed something subtle. As wealth accumulated, behavior shifted. People stopped asking what they contributed and started asking what they could extract. Luxury crept in quietly, first as comfort, then as entitlement. Offices became prizes. Positions became inherited. Power began to distance itself from accountability. The market still looked alive, but something underneath was tightening. Here's where the illusion becomes dangerous. When trade expands, it can hide decay. Busy markets distract from broken incentives. Rising revenue masks falling cohesion. And for a while, everyone benefits just enough to ignore the warning signs. But Ibn Khaldun saw that when money concentrates upward, circulation slows everywhere else. Wages stagnate. Small producers struggle. The poor adapt, then suffer. And the wealthy, insulated by status and proximity to power, mistake privilege for permanence. Then comes the shift most people miss. People begin to game the system instead of serve it. Officials exploit positions, merchants cut corners, rulers squeeze revenue harder, convinced the problem is insufficient control rather than collapsing trust. Each action feels rational on its own. Together, they poison the bloodstream of the economy. This is the moment Ibn Khaldun cared about most. Not the collapse itself, but the phase where society still looks strong, even as its foundations hollow out, where confidence replaces discipline, where success breeds fragility, where everyone assumes tomorrow will look like today. It never does, because once trust erodes, markets stop coordinating people and start pitting them against each other. And when that happens, the damage doesn't stay in the streets, it climbs upward, straight into the palace. Ibn Khaldun did not study power from a safe distance. He lived inside it. He served sultans, negotiated with rulers, held high office, lost it, regained it, and lost it again. He watched dynasties rise with confidence and unravel with excuses. And unlike most scholars of his time, he didn't mistake proximity to authority for loyalty to it. That made him dangerous, and it made him honest. Born in 1332 in Tunis, Ibn Khaldun came of age in a world already fracturing. Political authority was unstable. Courts shifted overnight. Allegiances changed faster than principles. He learned early that survival inside power required flexibility, but understanding power required distance, so he stepped away. At several points in his life, Ibn Khaldun withdrew from politics entirely, not because he rejected society, but because he wanted to see it clearly. He retreated to write, to observe, to think. And it was during one of these withdrawals that he produced his most famous work, a text that looked like history on the surface, but functioned as something far more unsettling, a diagnostic manual for civilizations. Here's what made it radical. Most historians asked what happened. Ibn Khaldun asked why it kept happening. Why did ruling families grow weak after generations of strength? Why did luxury corrode discipline? Why did taxation rise just as productivity fell? Why did states expand rapidly and then collapse slowly? He refused to accept coincidence as an answer. Instead, he treated societies like living systems, subject to patterns, incentives, feedback loops. He believed civilizations obeyed rules, not moral platitudes, but structural realities. And once you understood those rules, the future stopped looking random. Because when you see systems instead of stories, comforting narratives fall apart, blame becomes harder, excuses sound hollow, and the truth becomes uncomfortable. Decline is usually invited long before it is imposed. Ibn Khaldun understood this because he had seen it from both sides. He had watched rulers justify excess. He had watched elites protect themselves from consequence. He had watched institutions drift away from the people they claimed to serve. And he realized something few dared to say out loud. Empires don't collapse when they are conquered. They collapse when they stop believing in their own rules. That insight became the foundation of everything he wrote, and it leads directly to the single idea that holds his entire theory together, the force that builds societies, sustains them, and ultimately determines how they fall. Ibn Khaldun called it asi. The word doesn't translate cleanly, but its meaning is simple. It is social cohesion, group solidarity, the invisible bond that makes people act as a collective rather than as isolated individuals. And according to Ibn Khaldun, this single force explains why civilizations rise and why they fall. Strong societies begin with strong asabiyyah. People share hardship, they depend on one another. Loyalty matters more than comfort. Discipline matters more than luxury. In these early stages, inequality is limited, corruption is costly, and contribution is rewarded. That is how power is built. But asabiyyah is fragile. As societies grow wealthy, the memory of hardship fades. Comfort replaces discipline. Status replaces service. People begin to identify less with the group and more with their position inside it. Elites detach. Institutions formalize. Rules multiply, not to strengthen cohesion, but to manage its absence. The society still looks impressive. The army still marches. The treasury still fills. But the bond is weakening. Here's the reversal Ibn Khaldun emphasized. The very success created by strong asabiyyah eventually destroys it. Luxury softens character. Privilege dulls responsibility. Power concentrates, and once power concentrates, incentives shift. People stop asking, "What do we owe each other?" and start asking, "What can I keep?" That question changes everything, because when social cohesion erodes, economic behavior changes with it. Hoarding replaces circulation. Rent-seeking replaces production. Manipulation replaces trust. Markets don't disappear, they distort, and distortion spreads. Officials protect insiders, rulers extract more aggressively, ordinary people adapt by cutting corners or withdrawing effort. Each response feels defensive. Together, they accelerate decline. This is the moment when money stops functioning as a tool and starts functioning as a weapon. Ibn Khaldun understood that once asabiya weakens, no amount of law, force, or revenue can restore stability. Institutions without cohesion become shells. Authority without legitimacy becomes coercion. Wealth without trust becomes brittle. Collapse doesn't arrive as an explosion. It arrives as erosion. And when the erosion reaches a certain point, the system can no longer correct itself, because the collective will required to do so no longer exists. That realization led Ibn Khaldun to examine something even more fundamental than power or loyalty. He turned his attention to money. To Ibn Khaldun, money was never just metal stamped with authority. It was a signal, a reflection of how a society understood value, effort, and obligation. And once he saw money this way, the patterns of decline became impossible to ignore. In healthy societies, money circulates. It moves from hand to hand, rewarding labor, funding trade, and binding people together through exchange. It is boring, predictable, almost invisible. And that invisibility is the point. Money works best when no one obsesses over it. But when asabiya weakens, money changes character. It stops flowing and starts accumulating. Hoarding becomes rational, not because resources are scarce, but because trust is. People withdraw wealth from circulation out of fear. Fear that contracts won't hold, that institutions won't protect them, that tomorrow's rules will punish today's honesty. Hoarding kills, not dramatically, quietly. When wealth sits idle, production slows, workers lose income, markets thin out, prices distort. The economy doesn't collapse, it stiffens, and a stiff system shatters under pressure. Ibn Khaldun saw this clearly. He understood that money locked away contributes nothing to society. It creates artificial scarcity. It rewards caution over contribution. And over time, it trains people to prioritize protection instead of participation. That shift has consequences. Because once circulation slows, opportunism fills the gap. Speculation rises. Manipulation becomes tempting. Profit detaches from productive effort and attaches itself to timing, access, and influence. This is where trust begins to break, not all at once, one transaction at a time. People stop assuming fairness, they double-check weights, they demand guarantees, they pad prices. The market still functions, but now it's defensive. Every exchange becomes a negotiation against betrayal. Ibn Khaldun didn't condemn profit, he understood ambition. He believed trade was natural and necessary, but he drew a sharp line between earning and extracting. Money gained through contribution strengthens society. Money gained through manipulation weakens it. And once a culture begins rewarding the second more than the first, decline stops being abstract. It becomes structural, because money, in the end, does not measure wealth. It measures trust. And when trust drains out of a system, money is the first place the damage appears, even if the final collapse comes later. That realization forced Ibn Khaldun to look upward, because if markets were breaking down, the question was no longer about merchants alone. It was about rulers. When Ibn Khaldun looked at collapsing economies, he rarely blamed the market first. He blamed the state. Not because rulers caused every problem, but because they had the power to accelerate all of them. In his time, one of the most common tools of desperate rulers was currency manipulation. Coins were quietly debased, gold content shaved down, silver diluted. The stamp stayed the same, but the value inside was hollowed out. To the ruler, it looked clever. To the people, it felt confusing. To Ibn Khaldun, it was theft. Because when a state tampers with money, it breaks a promise. The promise that today's labor will still matter tomorrow. The promise that value is stable. The promise that authority exists to protect exchange, not exploit it. Once that promise is broken, trust doesn't vanish instantly. It leaks. Merchants raise prices to protect themselves. Workers demand more pay. Foreign currencies begin to circulate quietly. Barter returns at the margins. The economy adapts, but in doing so, it reveals its fear. This is the danger Ibn Khaldun warned about. Currency debasement doesn't just raise prices, it teaches people that rules are flexible for those in power. And once people learn that lesson, they apply it everywhere else. Officials skim more aggressively. Tax collectors push harder. Merchants justify cheating. Why be honest in a dishonest system? Here's the reversal most rulers miss. By manipulating currency to survive the present, they poison the future. Short-term relief creates long-term fragility. Revenue increases briefly, then collapses as trust evaporates. Ibn Khaldun saw this pattern repeat across dynasties. Each believed it was the exception. Each thought it could manage the damage. None of them were, because money, once corrupted at the top, carries that corruption downward. It spreads through markets, contracts, and expectations, until honesty becomes irrational and exploitation feels necessary. At that point, the state doesn't need enemies. It is dismantling itself. And the tragedy is that rulers often act this way, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of declining authority. Fear of admitting that the system itself is weakening. But fear-driven policy only accelerates decline. Ibn Khaldun understood something modern governments still struggle to accept. Legitimacy cannot be printed, diluted, or enforced forever. Once people stop believing in the fairness of the system, force becomes the only language left, and force is expensive. That realization pushed his thinking even further away from rulers and markets, and toward the deeper engine underneath both: human behavior. At the center of Ibn Khaldun's thinking was a simple belief: people respond to incentives, not ideals, not speeches, not laws written on paper, but to what is rewarded and what is punished. In strong societies, effort matters, work is respected, skill is valued. People believe that contributing to the system improves their own future. Labor is not just a necessity, it is a source of dignity. That belief changes behavior. Farmers invest in land, artisans refine craft, merchants build reputation, soldiers defend borders not only out of fear, but out of belonging. The system reinforces itself because participation feels worthwhile. But as Asabia weakens, incentives drift. Unearned wealth grows faster than earned income. Access matters more than skill. Position matters more than contribution. People begin to notice that influence pays better than effort, and they adjust accordingly. Quietly at first. Work becomes something to escape, not perfect. Rent-seeking replaces production. Talented people redirect energy away from building and toward navigating power. And those who still produce begin to feel foolish for doing so. This is the moment Ibn Khaldun feared most. Because once exploitation becomes rational, decline accelerates without resistance. The system still functions. Taxes are still collected, markets still operate. But the moral logic underneath has inverted. Instead of asking, how do I add value? People ask, how do I extract it? And that question spreads. Institutions begin protecting insiders. Laws are enforced unevenly. Reputation matters less than connection. Each layer of society adapts to the incentives above it, and each adaptation makes recovery harder. Ibn Khaldun understood that this wasn't about individual virtue. It was about structure. People are not suddenly worse. The system is simply teaching them the wrong lessons. And once enough people learn those lessons, reversing course requires more than reform. It requires rebuilding trust from the ground up. That's why Ibn Khaldun believed dignity of labor was not a moral slogan, but an economic necessity. Societies grow strong when contribution is visible, rewarded, and protected. They grow fragile when shortcuts outperform effort, because when productive people disengage, collapse doesn't arrive loudly, it arrives as stagnation, and stagnation prepares the ground for something even more dangerous: institutional decay. Ibn Khaldun believed institutions were the skeleton of civilization, invisible most of the time, essential all the time. Courts, tax systems, markets, administrations, these weren't just tools of governance, they were signals, daily reminders of whether fairness still existed, and whether rules applied equally to everyone. As long as institutions were predictable, people cooperated, disputes were settled without violence, contracts meant something, risk was manageable, even inequality could be tolerated, because the system still felt legitimate. But once fairness eroded, institutions stopped stabilizing society. They destabilized it. Selective enforcement replaced justice. Laws bent for the connected. Corruption became procedural instead of exceptional. And people adjusted their expectations downward, not because they wanted to, but because experience taught them to. This is where trust collapses fastest. Not in markets, not in currency, but in institutions meant to protect both. When courts favor power over principle, contracts lose meaning. When taxes feel arbitrary, compliance turns into evasion. When rules change without warning, people stop planning for the future and start surviving the present. Trust is policy. And once institutions broadcast dishonesty, every layer beneath them absorbs the message. Merchants pad prices, workers cut effort, officials extract bribes to compensate for uncertainty. Each response is defensive. Together, they form a self-reinforcing loop of decay. Ibn Khaldun recognized this as a cascade. Institutional failure teaches individuals to abandon restraint. Individual abandonment overwhelms institutions further, and soon, even well-intentioned reforms fail, because no one believes they will last. This is why he dismissed surface-level fixes. More rules without fairness only add friction. More enforcement without legitimacy only adds fear. More taxation without trust only accelerates flight. Once institutions lose credibility, restoring them becomes exponentially harder. People don't risk honesty in systems that punish it. At that stage, collapse doesn't require catastrophe. It only requires time, because a society without trusted institutions can still function briefly, but it cannot coordinate. And without coordination, no civilization sustains itself for long. This realization led Ibn Khaldun to one final synthesis. He saw all of this not as chaos, but as a cycle. Ibn Khaldun did not believe civilizations collapsed randomly. He believed they aged. Like living organisms, societies passed through stages: birth, growth, maturity, and decline. Not because fate demanded it, but because incentives changed as success accumulated. In the beginning, societies are lean. Scarcity forces cooperation. Survival rewards discipline. Leadership is close to the people it governs. Asabira is strong because it has to be. This is when expansion happens. Energy is high. Corruption is risky. Luxury is limited. People tolerate hardship because they believe the system is worth defending. The economy grows not because it is sophisticated, but because it is aligned. Then comes success. Wealth increases. Administration expands, institutions formalize, comfort spreads, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the original discipline weakens. The generation that remembers hardship gives way to one that inherits stability. This is the dangerous phase, because prosperity hides decay. Taxes rise to support growing complexity. Bureaucracy thickens. Elites separate themselves from consequences. The system still works, but now it relies on momentum instead of cohesion. Ibn Khaldun warned that this phase is often mistaken for permanence. It isn't. As incentives drift, behavior follows. Rent-seeking grows, enforcement becomes selective. Contribution matters less than access. People adapt rationally to a system that no longer rewards virtue, and in doing so, they accelerate its decline. Then comes fragility. Revenue shrinks despite higher taxes. Trust erodes despite more laws. Authority relies increasingly on force rather than legitimacy. The state looks powerful, but it is hollow. One shock, economic, political, or external, is enough to expose the weakness. Collapse doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as inevitability. And here is Ibn Khaldun's most unsettling insight. The cycle does not break itself. Unless incentives are consciously realigned, decline continues until a new group, leaner, more cohesive, less burdened by luxury, replaces the old order. Renewal comes not from reform alone, but from rebuilding cohesion. This is why history feels repetitive. Not because humans are stupid, but because success changes what systems reward. Once you see the cycle, you start seeing it everywhere, including now. Look around. The pattern Ibn Khaldun described is no longer hidden in medieval chronicles. It is playing out in real time, across economies that look advanced, stable, and permanent. Wealth has never been higher. Institutions have never been more complex. Markets have never moved faster, and yet trust keeps falling. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this immediately. He would see rising inequality not as a moral failure, but as a structural warning. He would see speculation outpacing production. He would see access rewarded more than effort. He would see institutions expanding even as their legitimacy thins. This is the uncomfortable part. Modern societies assume sophistication protects them from decline. Technology feels like insulation. Scale feels like strength. Complexity feels like control. It isn't, because the cycle does not care about innovation. It responds to incentives, and when incentives reward extraction over contribution, the outcome is the same regardless of era. Look at housing markets where speculation prices out labor. Look at financial systems that reward leverage more than productivity. Look at political systems where proximity to power matters more than accountability. These are not isolated failures. They are symptoms. And here's the key point Ibn Khaldun would insist on. The danger is not greed. Greed has always existed. The danger is normalization. When people stop being shocked by imbalance, decline accelerates. When exploitation feels ordinary, cohesion dissolves. When trust is replaced by compliance, systems grow brittle. This is why collapse often surprises those living through it, because the numbers still look impressive. Markets still function. Institutions still operate. The surface holds until it doesn't. Ibn Khaldun never claimed decline was unavoidable, but he warned that ignoring incentive drift makes it inevitable. Reversing the cycle requires more than stimulus or reform. It requires restoring the logic that rewards contribution, protects fairness, and rebuilds social cohesion. Without that, complexity only delays the outcome. It does not prevent it. And that brings us to the final question. If the mechanism is this clear, what does survival actually require? Ibn Khaldun did not leave behind a list of policies. He left behind a warning and a principle. He believed civilizations survive, not because they are rich, advanced, or powerful, but because they align incentives with responsibility, because they reward contribution over extraction, because they protect fairness before enforcing control. In his view, prosperity is never the starting point. Cohesion is when people believe the system is fair, they cooperate. When they cooperate, markets function. When markets function, wealth circulates. And when wealth circulates, societies grow resilient instead of brittle. Break that chain at any point, and decline begins. This is why Ibn Khaldun placed such weight on trust. Trust between rulers and ruled. Trust between buyers and sellers. Trust that effort will be rewarded, not punished. Trust that rules exist to protect participation, not privilege. Once that trust erodes, no amount of force can replace it. More laws won't restore it. More money won't buy it. More complexity won't hide its absence forever. Because when people stop believing in the fairness of the system, they don't rebel immediately. They withdraw, they disengage, they hedge, they protect themselves. And a society full of people protecting themselves cannot sustain itself for long. Ibn Khaldun understood something that still unsettles modern thinkers. Collapse is rarely a technical failure. It is a moral and structural one. Not morality as preaching, but morality as incentive design, as the quiet architecture shaping everyday behavior. This is why his ideas still matter. They explain why financial crises repeat, why inequality destabilizes instead of stabilizing, why institutions fail even as they expand, and why history keeps warning us long before it punishes us. Understanding Ibn Khaldun is not about nostalgia or medieval philosophy. It is about recognizing the mechanics of survival. Because civilizations don't fall when they are attacked. They fall when they forget what holds them together. If money becomes detached from trust, it turns corrosive. If power becomes detached from responsibility, it turns fragile. If success becomes detached from contribution, it turns fatal. Ibn Khaldun saw this clearly, centuries before we built systems large enough to test it at scale. History does not repeat itself exactly, but if you don't understand its patterns, it will trap you inside them. And that is why learning how civilizations rise and fall is not academic. It's protective, because the future doesn't punish ignorance, it exploits it.